Okay, so in my paper I will discuss Rancière's conception of aesthetics and the sensible that I believe is the basis of his conceptual apparatus. And therefore I will review his references to Kant and Schiller that I see crucial for his politics of art. In the book entitled, in English, Politics of Aesthetics, Rancière provides perhaps the most structured and extensive conceptualization of his crucial concept, the distribution of the sensible. I quote, "I call the distribution of the sensible the system of self-evident facts of sense perception that simultaneously discloses the existence of something in common and the delimitations that define the respective parts and positions within it. A distribution of the sensible therefore establishes at one and the same time something in common that is shared and exclusive parts. This apportionment of parts and positions is based on a distribution of spaces, times, and forms of activity that determines the very manner in which something in common lends itself to participation and in what way various individuals have a part in this distribution." End of quote. So for him, this means that there is an aesthetics at the basis of politics. And here he defines this aesthetics as, I quote, "Aesthetics can be understood in a Kantian sense, re-examined perhaps by Foucault, as the system of a priori forms determining what presents itself to sense experience. It is a delimitation of spaces and times, of the visible and the invisible, of speech and noise that simultaneously determines the place and the stakes of politics as a form of experience." End of quote. So in this analogy, Rancière refers to Kant's so-called Copernican turn, where a priori forms of sense perception, that is space and time, as part of the subject's cognitive apparatus, provide form and structure to multiplicity perceived by the senses. In this context, the distribution of the sensible is an a priority of experience. Sense experiences are not caused by objective impressions, instead they are arranged by the distribution of the sensible. But this straightforward analogy cannot end here, because Kant makes a clear distinction between sensibility and understanding in his Critique of Pure Reason, and he defines them as singular qualities, faculties. As singular faculties. I quote, "Thoughts without concepts are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Therefore, it is equally necessary to make our concepts sensuous, that is, to add their object in intuition, as to make our intuitions intelligible, that is, to bring them under concepts." End of quote. Sensibility cannot produce any experiences by itself, but collaborates with a priori concepts of understanding, which compose the second half of Kant's Copernican turn. But categories ultimately determine not only our cognitive mode, but also a priori apply to the objects of possible experience. Rancière confirms that the sensible experiences does not concern only the sensible that we perceive, but the sensible that we make sense of. In an interview, he highlights that the distribution of the sensible is not the relativity of sensory perception. A passive reception of sensory impulses is always bound together with something else, which endows it with meaning. I quote, "The sensible is sense distributed. The sense related to sense, the visible articulated with the sayable, the interpreted, evaluated, etc." End of quote. In the aesthetic dimension, he refers to Kant's critique of judgment, and I quote again, "First, there is something given, a form that is provided by sense. Second, the apprehension of this form is not only a matter of sense, rather, sense itself is doubled. The apprehension puts into play a certain relation between what Kant calls faculties, between faculty that offers the given and faculty that makes something out of it. End of quote. So the distribution of the sensible turns out to be a certain relation between the sensible and the intelligible. And Rancière defines three forms of this relationship. The first two are hierarchical. That means that one faculty governs the other, while the third is a certain equality between the faculties. The distribution of the sensible, paralleled with the a priori forms of sensibility, is thus identified with the domination of reason over sensibility. The distribution of the sensible could thus be understood as a mechanism which determines the possibility of sense experience by a set of predetermined senses. However, unlike Kant, Rancière is not interested in the scope of human knowledge, but conceptualizes the relationship between the sensible and the communal. In his somehow fragmentary explications, he relates the distribution of the sensible to a wide range of phenomena, from sense perception to social order. In the sensus, for instance, he defines it as I quote, a generally implicit law that defines the forms of partaking by first defining the modes of perception in which they are inscribed. A partition of the sensible refers to the manner in which a relation between a shared common and the distribution of exclusive parts is determined in sensory experience. This later form of distribution itself proposes a distribution of what is visible and what is not, of what can be heard and what cannot. End of quote. The distribution of the sensible is essentially a relational concept that, schematically put, concerns three aspects. The first is the definition of the common, the second, allocation and partition of this common, and the third, perception and functioning of this partition as common. And each of these aspects functions on three levels. The level of sensible experience, the level of sense givens, sense attributes and capacities, and the third, the social order. Kant's and Rancière's a priorities both designate conditions of possibilities, but necessity and universality are relativized by Rancière. The distribution of the sensible is contingent and changeable. It is, I quote, a certain cutting of space and time that binds together practices, forms of visibility, and patterns of intelligibility. End of quote. Sense experience that is shaped in a particular regime of the sensible perpetuates social differences as natural, obvious, and necessary. Rancière historizes Kant's substitution of the objectivity of knowledge with the necessity of an intersubjective a priority on an intersubjective level. The sensible is put into two relationships in this a priority. This a priority establishes a relationship between the sensible and the intelligible, and at the same time conditions the scheme of relations between the sensible and the communal. And between these two levels, there is not only an analogy, but a correlation. The relationship between sensibility and understanding is a priori of community. While the first part of this a priority relates Rancière to Kant with the idea of the relationship between sensibility and reason as a contingent foundation of any social formation, he is strongly related to Friedrich Schiller. In his work on the aesthetic education of man, Schiller understands human as doubly determined by sensibility and by reason, or by the material and the formal impulse. Cultivation of only one of them in a certain part of community institutes the partition of a higher class of reason and the lower class of sensibility. Quote, With us, one might almost be tempted to assert the mental faculties show themselves detached in operation as psychology separates them in idea. And we see not merely individual persons, but whole classes of human beings developing only a part of their capacities, while the rest of them, like a stunted plant, show only a feeble vestige of their nature. So the relationship between sensibility and understanding is thus the constitutive element of a community, and this means that its transformation can produce another aesthetics and base a different form of community. This is the second sense of aesthetics that Rancière speaks about, and it is based precisely on the revocation of this first aesthetics. Its essential concept is the aesthetic experience, Rancière's version of a Copernican turn in aesthetics, which supplements the relationship between the object and the subject with the subject's sensation. It is based on Kant's experience of the beautiful as a specific relationship of harmony between the faculties, especially through Schiller's interpretation as a free play. Aesthetic experience is inconsistent with the ordinary experiences determined by the distribution of the sensible and functions in the frame of another distribution of the sensible, which, I quote, suspends the ordinary connections not only between appearance and reality, but also between form and matter, activity and passivity, understanding and sensibility. This is from Aesthetics and its Discontents. For Schiller, the unity of impulses that has been broken is restored through the third aesthetic impulse, or the impulse of the play, where sensibility and understanding cultivate each other, and only in this way man becomes whole, and only as whole he is free and can form a free society. Rancière underlines the political implications of Schiller. Aesthetics has its own politics precisely because it forms a specific autonomy through the cancellation of the hierarchies. In this concept, art appears as the main carrier of the new aesthetics and of the new community. By establishing a link between politics of art and the sensible dimension of aesthetics, Rancière responds to some of the main issues related to art's politicity. In this context that I have sketched, the idea of the aesthetic revolution first arises from the idea of the revolution of experience and concerns the relationships between sensibility and understanding, and is the foundation of political or social revolution. The essential difference between two experiences therefore lies in the procedure of sense-making. Instead of spontaneous sense-making of prescribed meanings in the ordinary experience, in the aesthetic experience one must employ interpretation. Like in Kant's experience of the beautiful, the representation is not subsumed under any concept. In aesthetic experience, the understanding cannot automatically make sense of the sensible given. In the Emancipated Spectator, Rancière argues that the spectator of an artwork is active, he observes, compares, translates, and relates to his subjective experiences. It could be also said that in this aesthetics, a surplus of the sensible appears that cannot be made sense of in the current regime of distribution. In aesthetic revolution and its outcomes, Rancière employs the notion of heterogeneous sensible, which applies to a work of art as a free appearance. This is a sensible freed from its subordination to reason, but also the source of a heteronomy, which is the counterpart of aesthetic autonomy and signifies the impossibility of making sense, unavailability of the sensible. Art's politicity is formed in this interplay of the opposites and is thus only a possibility. With this, Rancière offers a response to theses which see the loss of art's political power in the impossibility of transmitting the art's intent. A prominent example of this is the institutionalization of art, first conceptualized by Peter Bürger. Rancière's emphasis is centered on the receiver and his inherent activity. The recognition of the receiver's ability to freely interpret what he perceives is part of art's contribution to emancipation. But this displaced strength of art is at the same time its weakness. There is no necessity of the political effect. And Rancière calls it the paradoxical efficiency of the discontinuity between sensible forms of artistic production and sensible forms of receiving. He speaks about that in the Emancipated Spectator. Paradoxicality is thus a constitutional element of the aesthetic logic, the simultaneity of distinction and indistinction, autonomy and heteronomy, etc. These dualities are perceived as oppositions from the very standpoint of the first distribution of the sensible. The strict distinction between sensibility and understanding, which is the form of the relationship of inequality, is itself a contingent presupposition. This can be seen, for example, in Rancière's use of the word sense in both its significations as sensible perception and as meaning. And this survives the translation in English. So he defines the relation between sense and sense as the relationship between the sensible and its intelligible sense. I quote from Aesthetic Separation, Aesthetic Community. This is a relationship between what is seen and what is thought and what is felt. But at another place, he denies that it is the difference between sensible and intelligible. Instead, it is the difference between the same. The distinction thus falls to the stage of presupposition. Sensibility is thus not only always in some relationship with understanding, but it cannot be distinguished from it. Sensibility can only be autonomous in this paradoxical relationship. So through the juxtaposition of Kant and Schiller, the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible appears as the paradigm of binary logic of exclusive and strictly determined opposite categories that dominates the police distribution of the sensible, but is also very present in the history of Western philosophy. It is the logic of one and the other, the dominant and the submissive, of one way of explanation and of constraint. The denigration of the sensible is part of this logic. And Kantian idea of necessity establishes one distribution as absolute and is inscribed in this paradigm. The prominent example of this binary logic is the modernism-postmodernism dichotomy. Art in the aesthetic regime is founded on paradox, again as conceptualized through Schiller, between art as separated from life and art that is becoming life. One-sided definitions of modernism that identify it with only one artistic tendency, as also those which understand modernism and postmodernism as two historical periods, prevent the formation of dissensus and do not grasp the paradoxical duality. Postmodernism establishes a kind of consensus where the paradox is resolved in a temporal distribution. Do I have more time? Yeah. Okay. So now I would just like to point out some other ideas, some other reflections. I think that this new aesthetics is sometimes only negatively defined. It is just invalidation of the first aesthetics, and it always functions in opposition. It is always relational. Like the aesthetic regime is formed in opposition to the representative regime of art, and I think that Rancière always preserves this tension. But there is also an inner tension inherent to the aesthetic regime. The notion of a priority that can be identified as the basis for Rancière's understanding of art thus stems from Kant, but also differs significantly for him. Rancière's conception of the sensible is Kantian as far as it contains something that precedes all experience and determines what will be possible to be perceived and how. I think that Rancière could get also other ideas already from Kant, but he sees his philosophy as unpolitical. Kant's a priority already implies an intersubjectivity constituted by the universal structure of human experience, a community based on a common faculties, which is crucial to Rancière himself. But this community is universal, unchangeable, and generic. Kant lacks the idea of dual signification of the distribution and understands it only in the sense of having something in common. Kant abstracts from the historical conditions. His thought is thus unpolitical. So that is why Rancière refers to Schiller. And I think that this implies that Rancière has a hidden premise of his aesthetics, that is Schiller's Anthropology of human wholeness. He claims that inequality presupposes equality, and every distribution presupposes something in common. But this brings up a certain unease with his statement that equality even is a presupposition. And Rancière does not seem to approve of some idea of human nature, and he disputes the idea of a natural necessity, necessary a priority. But I think we can nevertheless identify something close to it in the basis of his thought, an universal intrasubjective a priori. Okay, I will finish here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nina.